today I'm going to be speaking about the French Revolution of May 1968. And to be clear, that's precisely what it was. It was a revolution. Now, this was one of the largest general strikes in history, encompassing over 10 million workers at its peak. It was a movement in which students played a leading role, acting as a barometer for the class tensions in society. It involved people of very different backgrounds coming together in solidarity against capitalism and against the French Republic. Now, over the course of its 2-week duration, factories and universities were occupied, workers and students were in the streets. All the while, labor leadership and so-called Marxists did what they could to keep power in the hands of the capitalist class. There must be no mistaking the significance of these events to the history of the student movement, to the working class, and to the struggle for a socialist future. Now, with this in mind, I'm going to give an outline of the events and then launch into a discussion of the most important lessons that we can draw from this example and then apply them to the period of social upheaval that we're currently witnessing. Now, before discussing the details of the revolution itself, it's important to understand the historical context in which these events unfolded. Now, one of the most fascinating parts of the movement is that it emerged like a thunderbolt from a clear blue sky. That is, that nobody saw it coming. It took the capitalists and even many socialists completely by surprise. Now, we have to understand that the movement took place at the height of capitalism's post-war upswing. The end of the Second World War brought about a tremendous economic boom, which saw standards of living rising across the continent, including in France. It seemed to many at the time that Marx's analysis of capitalism as a boom and bust system, that is one which will inevitably lead to another crisis, was simply incorrect. This was a period of unfathomable economic optimism, where people truly believed in unending growth and in the supreme efficiency of markets. Now, in fact, many intellectuals and politicians of the time went so far as to say that revolutions and class struggle were simply a thing of the past. In May 1968, for example, you can look at The Economist, which published a special supplement on France, which enthusiastically sang the praises of French capitalism in this period under the leadership of President Charles de Gaulle. The article points out that the French have a higher standard of living than their English neighbors, that the average French citizen eats more meat, owns more cars, and exceed their fellow Europeans in numerous indicators of a highly stable and developed society. It seemed to the editors of The Economist that this was an epoch of unbridled luxury and innovation, an epoch in which it would be absurd to even imagine the possibility of a mass movement emerging against capitalism. And yet this was published a week before the declaration of the general strike. Now, perhaps we could forgive the capitalist press for its lack of foresight and its inability to read class tensions in society, but they weren't the only ones who were caught off guard. In fact, many prominent Marxists completely failed to recognize the potential of the French students and the working class. Notably, a prominent Marxist, Ernest Mandel, who was actually living in France at the time, spoke in London about a month before these great events, and throughout his entire talk, on which he discussed guerrilla movements in the colonial world mostly, but he didn't mention the French proletariat a single time. And he was actually asked by someone in the audience, well, okay, what about the working class here in Europe? What about the potential for revolution in your own country of France? And his response has not stood up well to the annals of history. He answered that the French working class were Americanized, that the French working class were bourgeoisified, and that their only interest lay in going to the movies and watching television. Now, he went even further than that, saying that you could completely write off the potential of the French working class for 20 years. Now, I'd like to make it abundantly clear that he said this in April of 1968, less than 1 month before the supposedly Americanized and bourgeoisified French workers would partake in the greatest revolutionary general strike in European history. So if nobody saw this coming, the journalists didn't, nor did the government, nor did the socialists, then where exactly did the revolutionary movement of May 1968 come from? Well, in answering this question, we have to first look at the material conditions existing in France following the Second World War. Prior to 1945, France is not as we think of it today. It's not a heavily industrialized country. Its economy is actually mostly based not on the production of goods, but on banking, on finance capital, and perhaps most significantly on the exploitation of its many colonies. It was only after the devastation of the Second World War and the loss of many of these colonies that France began to invest heavily in industry, leading to the emergence of a strong working class, who, as Marx had anticipated, would become the grave diggers of the system which had spawned them. Just to give you some examples, in 1931, 2/3 of all French industrial enterprises had no wage workers at all. Another third had fewer than 10, and only half of 1% employed more than 100 people. And similarly, at this time, you had half of the French population making its living off of agriculture. To compare that to the modern situation, today that number sits around 6%. So rapid industrialization had caused a seismic shift in the balance between classes in society. Former peasants and small farmers who were previously confined to the countryside were drawn into the ranks of the urban working class. So in short, the workforce of 1968 was strong, it was young, and it was growing each day. It was becoming aware of its own power and of its right to control society. It was precisely this awareness which caught the world off guard. Now, the years leading up to the general strike see a subtle growth of discontent among the French working class, but the revolution of May 1968 needed something of a push to set it into action. It needs a spark. And this spark actually comes in the form of student demonstrations that spread across the country, as they had in many countries across the globe during this period. Over the course of 1967 and 1968, you have students in America, Northern Ireland, Great Britain, France, Mexico, as well as numerous other countries, launching mass movements inspired by a combination of factors, revolutions in the colonial world, opposition to the Vietnam War, and just growing discontent with traditional politics and the status quo. Now, within this context, students of Ontario University hold a series of sit-ins and occupations of campus buildings in March of 1968. Of course, the government, as governments like to do, responds by sending in the CRS, the riot police, who drive the students off the campus and secure it once again. Now, these images that come into the press the next day of these just thugs pummeling these students spread across the country, and they inspire solidarity movements on other campuses. Most notably for these events, the Sorbonne in Paris is occupied by its students in late April. On May 3rd, the CRS arrived to once again clear the courtyard of the university, this time the Sorbonne. Clashes between students and police spill over into the nearby Latin Quarter, and there are hundreds of injuries and arrests by the end of the night. The police are under the impression that this is over, that no one's going to be stupid enough to come back out and protest anymore. But of course, they couldn't be more wrong. The next day, all courses at the Sorbonne are cancelled, and the student unions call for an indefinite strike. Clashes continue between demonstrators and police each day, until on May 10th, student unions across the country declare solidarity with the students in Paris. Meanwhile, students at the Sorbonne set up barricades to prevent police entry onto campus. And that night, when the CRS attempt to take down these barricades, it culminates in the worst riot yet. But there is one key distinction between this confrontation and those preceding it, and that's the allocation of injuries. Of the 367 hospitalizations that occur from this riot, 251 of them are police. The students understand that they need to fight back against police repression, and ordinary Parisians defend them. You have residents of the Latin Quarter who are recorded as, first of all, joining students out in the street, but also doing things like dropping flower pots out of their windows onto police cars and preventing the police from getting onto the campus. Now, looking at this historical example, we see the role that students must play in a revolutionary movement. Students are barometers of tensions building up in society. That is, when a revolutionary epoch arises, they are almost always the first ones to move. And to be honest, I think this is because we have the most to win and the least to lose from a radical transformation of society. We can clearly see the problems inherent in capitalism, and we refuse to submit ourselves to a lifetime of exploitation. That being said, students, so long as they act on their own, are quite weak. Now, I don't mean to say that those of you in the audience aren't quite as physically strong or aren't incapable of performing as many push-ups as the next guy. But what I do mean to say is that we don't have the ability as a group to force society to bend to our will. Now, take, for example, a student strike. When students go on strike, we can go out into the streets, we can spread awareness about our cause, and we can interfere with the operations of our campus. But ultimately, so long as we are alone, we will lose. Eventually, excitement is going to die down. Students are going to begin to feel hopeless towards the movement. They're going to start trickling back to their lecture halls. And the university, which has hardly really been injured by the refusal of students to go to class, is going to continue to do precisely what it was doing before. Now, we can compare this to a worker strike in which things are completely different. Since labor is necessary for the functioning of society, workers are able to force the hand of their employers and of the state in a way that's completely beyond the power of students. Students, of course, who don't play such a central role are not. So as a result, it's an absolute imperative that the student movement and the labor movement be viewed not as distinct struggles, but as two sides of the same coin. While students may be weak on their own, when united with the entirety of the working class, no force on earth is greater. And therefore, we're also obligated to support workers in their struggles. And as one of the most revolutionary segments of society, we bear an important responsibility to light the fuse for social explosion, that is revolution, and to act as an inspiration to the working class. This is the role that students should play, and this is precisely what happens in May of 1968. Now, back to France, right? It's May 13th, and the country's three main unions, the CGT, the CFDT, and the FEN, declare a one-day general strike under tremendous pressure from rank-and-file membership. Now, while the students are the first to take a stand against the French state, their cause resonates with the French working class, and it uncovers a previously latent accumulation of resentment among the workers. Despite the flowy claims of the economists, the benefits of the post-war economic boom had barely trickled down to the French working class. And while standards of living were in fact increasing, the workers' share of the increased production was rapidly declining. So on the day of the general strike, May 13th, between 800,000 and 1 million workers and students will pour out into the streets of Paris. Now, the union leadership anticipate that this is going to be a one-day ordeal, but unsurprisingly, the workers take a different view. Far from being a one-day strike, the movement takes on a life of its own, and mass demonstrations and strikes encompassing a total of over 10 million workers sweep the country for the next 2 weeks. Now, this period sees all kinds of things going on. It's almost hard to keep track of everything that's happening. But to give you a few examples, it starts with waves of factory occupations that completely paralyze industry as newspaper distribution stops across the country. On May 18th, the country's coal mines are shut down. And along with that, public transit in major cities are seized by their workers. Next, national railway, air transport, shipyard, and ferry workers take control of their respective stations and ports, while gas and electrical services are seized by their workers, and services are only given to households and those workplaces which join in the strike movement. And this revolutionary spirit is not confined even to the industrial working class. Teachers, professionals, scientists, and athletes join in the struggle and come out openly in support of the strike committee. Campuses are occupied by students, observatories by astronomers, and even medical associations by doctors, strangely enough. You have one of these bizarre incidents where a church in the Latin Quarter is actually occupied by young Catholics who demand that instead of being used to say Mass and to pray, it be used as a debating hall for what's to come. And of course, with the schools closed, you have teachers and students organizing playgroups, nurseries, free meals, and activities for the children of those who are on strike. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the country at this time is electric. Above all of the factories and the universities and the public buildings, the tricolor of the French Republic is replaced with the red flag, right? The symbol of the radicals of 1848, the French radicals of 1871, the Paris Commune, that is, and the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. In the crowded streets of Paris, you have ordinary people who maybe a week before had been chatting about the weather or the results of the latest football match, all of a sudden are engaging in heated political debates. At the Sorbonne, handwritten revolutionary manifestos are everywhere. In fact, you can't find a surface without them. And the statues of Louis XIV and Cardinal Richelieu, these great figures of French history, are adorned with red caps and just covered over in photos of revolutionary figures. Power is in the streets, and it's for the taking of the people of France. The clashes, of course, continue with the CRS, and the workers and students continue to face tear gas and baton charges from the increasingly worried defenders of the Gaullist regime. And as the strike goes on, it becomes increasingly clear to the French ruling class that the students and the workers are not going away. Charles de Gaulle, the president, tries to ease tensions, and he promises a referendum and a new batch of elections to the National Assembly. But the workers know better than to compromise and hand power back to the parliament. Understanding their potential as a united class and realizing the weakness of their foe, the workers actually refuse to print the ballots so that the election can occur. And then when the government tries to get the ballots printed in Belgium, the Belgian workers, in the spirit of solidarity, likewise refuse. At this stage in the struggle, it's apparent that the state, for all of its seeming might, can't actually withstand the will of the people when they're united and fighting in their own interests. In fact, if you look at the memoirs of notable government figures in this period, such as the memoirs of Georges Pompidou, who's the prime minister at this time, he admits that the government actually feared this movement as a threat to republican rule itself. And perhaps a better way to read that would be to say a threat to capitalism itself. As all of this, as all of this is going on, de Gaulle actually flees the presidential palace and goes to West Germany, while privately he continues to express confidence that the leaders of the French Communist Party will save his government. Now, unfortunately, as crazy as this sounds, he isn't wrong about this. From the start, the French communists are hostile to the movement, and they call the students all kinds of things: adventurous, provocateurs, ultra-leftists, you name it. And even as millions of workers take to the streets, they continue to discourage revolution and to espouse this idea that the state is too strong to be overthrown. The spontaneous movement of the workers and students doesn't match the rigid trajectory that they imagine a revolution in France must take, and likewise they end up protecting the capitalists from the working class. And as all of this is going on, de Gaulle continues to promote himself as a strong man. He ridicules the protesters in some very colorful language, and he accuses them of being nothing more than a bunch of spoiled middle-class university students. Now, actually, the reason I bring this up is this idea is still around today. There are those who claim that the events of May '68 are really nothing more but some attempt for male students at the Sorbonne to get into the female dormitories. But of course, this viewpoint completely neglects the fact that at this point in the struggle, to be honest, students were quite a minimal factor. When you have 10 million workers on strike, and the French population is only 51 million people. Moreover, of these 10 million workers, only 3.5 of them are actually union members, with the rest participating in completely illegal strikes. So there can be no doubt in light of this that the events of May '68 are nothing other than a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, and it's foolish to claim anything else. Now the period of instability continues, and by May 20th, the government is evidently on the verge of collapse. Right? The potential for a peaceful transition of power from the ruling capitalist class to the working class is within reach, and all that's needed is some leadership, somebody who's willing to guide that transition. Now, I'm not sure how many of you read the news, or have been to France maybe, but France isn't a socialist paradise today. In fact, many of the issues which provoked precisely this revolution are still issues and still come up, every few years in every presidential election. So, we have to ask ourselves, what happened to this fabulous movement? Well, there's no adequate leadership that can guide the working class towards its ends. And as de Gaulle's regime is in its death throes, the leadership of the trade unions decide to throw it a lifeline. They actually enter into talks with the government, and they work to direct the revolutionary movement into what they call safe channels. Let's be clear, safe to the interests of the capitalists. On the 27th of May, they actually reach an agreement. So the union leadership and the government announce that the government is going to raise minimum wage, it's going to cut working hours, it's going to lower the age of retirement, and it's going to protect the right to organize unions. Let's be honest, these are tremendous concessions. And they're the types of concessions which you could only ever win when the capitalists are afraid of losing their grip on power. And yet they are still concessions. And in fact, when union reps actually bring the deal back to rank-and-file workers, they're often met with anger and resentment. And sometimes flat-out refusal, right? You have some workers, like those at the Renault, the car factory, who continue to strike and actually say, we don't care what deal you made with the government, we're going to keep going. And they completely refuse to capitulate to what they see as an unpopular deal and an unpopular government. But ultimately, without any leadership and with no end in sight, the strikers trickle back to work, and the revolution succumbs to exhaustion. The unions depict these concessions as a victory, but the workers know otherwise. In a sense, I think a general strike is a particularly interesting phenomenon because it poses a very interesting question, which is who really has power in our society? In the course of the struggle, the workers began to understand that the strike was about more than just economic demands for wage increases, for shortened working hours, and labor protections. It was also a political struggle, a struggle against the capitalist system itself. And it was an attempt to condemn the regime of Charles de Gaulle, and of course, all of the capitalists behind him, to the dustbin of history where they belonged. It was a struggle to smash the current state of affairs and to replace it with a democratic and humane society, one built on the basis of workers' control over industry. The potential for real change was there. It was clear to anyone who had witnessed the movement then, and it's clear to anyone who reads about it now. But this revolutionary potential was betrayed, and without any proper leadership, it dissipated quickly, like a puff of smoke. So, now that I've provided a very brief outline of the French Revolution of 1968, we can turn to how this history is relevant to the modern struggle of the workers and the students. Now, the pages of history are filled with revolutionary movements, particularly the pages of French history. And yet, I chose to speak on this particular revolution for a few reasons. Well, first, as I mentioned, the movement seemingly came out of nowhere. I quoted some of the remarks of the capitalist press and of leading socialist figures who had completely neglected the potential for any kind of movement against capitalism emerging anytime soon in France or even in Europe. All of them had neglected the potential for a struggle against capitalism, with the capitalists declaring an end to class struggle, and the socialists turning all of their attentions to revolutions in the colonial world. And in fact, when we look at kind of left-ish academics today, you see a similar picture. The postmodernists and the postcolonialist thinkers who infest the halls of beautiful institutions like this have gone so far as to deny the existence of the modern working class. And through their great talents in obscuring reality, they've outright denied the existence of the class struggle itself. And even people who call themselves Marxists, particularly in academia, have repeatedly made it clear that they have no faith in the revolutionary potential of today's workers and students. Somewhat famous example, as famous as academic Marxists go, David Harvey, a Marxist geographer, has actually not only written off the potential for a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, but he's actually claimed that capitalism is too big to fail. And he's argued that instead we should prop up a system which, mind you, he acknowledges is a failing one. So in a December 2019 episode of his somewhat ironically titled Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, he said that revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist economic system is, quote, nothing that's conceivable at the present time. It will not happen, it cannot happen, and we have to make sure that it does not happen. And this man still has the audacity, of course, to call himself a Marxist. Now, today's academic Marxists have evidently learned very little from the mistakes of their counterparts in 1968. But I don't want to give them too much attention, so we also have to look at some other things, and mainly really how the upheaval of May 68 can offer lessons on the role that students have to play in the struggle for socialism. Now, as I mentioned, the students of France acted as a spark in 1968. They ignited discontent lying dormant among the working class. But student protests would have gone nowhere without linking up with the trade unions and with the broader struggle of the workers. This could be seen in the fact that there were radical student movements across the globe in this period, which I hope someone maybe can touch on in the discussion. You had these seemingly great movements emerging around the world, and yet none of them went so far as that of the French. Even here in Canada, at U of T, the Canadian Union of Students, which is the predecessor of the current Canadian Federation of Students, to which the University of Toronto Student Union belongs, actually openly called for free education. It called for democratic control of campuses, and for a brief period, late 60s, early 70s, it even called for support for Viet Cong guerrillas. And yet, as much as in the US and the UK and in the rest of Europe, despite these very radical student movements existing, they failed to make common cause with the working class, and as a result, there was very little change. A misplaced faith in the power of students as a social group persists to this very day. For any of you who've ever been to rallies on campus, you might be familiar with a chant that goes something like, the students united will never be defeated. Now, it's popular, and it's quite a powerful slogan, I'll admit, and it's understandable, why this would be popular among students. But that doesn't change the fact that it simply isn't true. A cursory glance at the history of student movements will show that students united will nearly always be defeated, so long as they remain solely students, and they continue to isolate themselves from the broader struggle of the working class. No slogan, no matter how catchy, is going to change that. So this leads us into the third main lesson to be drawn from these unfoldings, and that's the necessity of proper leadership. From the start, we see that the leadership of the working class in France is hesitant to organize, or worse, even openly hostile to the emerging movement. The trade unions do what they can to minimize the outbreak of a general strike, and when forced to organize one, they do their best to minimize its scope. The Communist Party takes it a step further and completely writes off the movement from the start. In the end, it's this lack of proper leadership which condemned the students and workers of 1968 to defeat. The energy to irreversibly change society was present. It only needed to be channeled in the proper direction. This is the role that students and working class leadership ought to play in a revolutionary period. It's their job to behave as the memory, to draw lessons from the past, and offer the tools of Marxist struggle and Marxist analysis to those engaged in a war against capitalism. The defeat of the French Revolution of 1968 is therefore not the fault of the courageous youth and the courageous workers who occupied their factories, their schools, their workplaces, and who raised the banner of revolution and faced the baton charges of the CRS. The root of its failure lies in the betrayal of its leadership, who actually worked with the government to drive the movement into the ground and to ensure the continuation of French capitalism. So the often overlooked story of the French Revolution of 1968 is at one and the same time both a tragic story and a wildly inspiring one. The mobilization of 10 million workers and students in a struggle against capitalist exploitation amidst a period of unbridled affluence should serve as an example for the revolutionary potential of today's working class. And to be honest with you, the outlook of the future from 2022 is quite a bit grimmer than it was from 1968. Of course, the pandemic revealed the shortcomings of capitalism all too clearly, with governments bailing out banks and corporations in a desperate attempt to rein in economic catastrophe. This, of course, has led to a crisis of inflation that we're currently experiencing. Capitalism are becoming increasingly apparent, leading workers and youth to radical conclusions and paving the way for class battles of a tremendous scope in the near future. Now, in the past few years, we've seen revolutionary struggles in Myanmar, Colombia, Sri Lanka, against corruption and inequality, and that's named 3 out of countless. And as we speak, the students and workers of Iran are fighting their own struggle against a rotten and oppressive regime. I don't have time to go into it, but I hope maybe someone can come in on that also, on the discussion. That would be terrific. And yet, in Canada, we're yet to see a mass movement emerging against capitalism. But, don't give up hope. It's only a matter of time. In fact, if we look at the latest research, a 2021 poll, for example, found that 46% of Canadians aged 18 to 34 oppose capitalism. 46%, that's unprecedented. And I don't really need to tell those of you here why. Today's youth are among the most radical elements because all we've ever known is crisis. We're a generation that's never known capitalism in a natural upswing like those in 1968 had. So in light of these things, anyone who continues to claim that we're not living in a revolutionary epoch is simply ridiculous. Now is not the time to lament the failure of past revolutions or to reminisce about them as if there are no lessons to be learned for the class struggle of the 21st century. It's only a matter of time before events like those of 1968 are on our doorstep. It is the role of socialists to learn the lessons of history, to prepare for these great events, and to promote their resurgence. So it's a long-standing tradition upon the death of a monarch to say, the king is dead, long live the king, right? Well, today, when we look at the rise and fall of the French Revolution of 1968, and when we understand the material conditions which brought it about, and the material conditions in the contemporary world, we ought to say, the revolution is dead, long live the revolution.